On a freezing night in a quiet American town, a 6-year-old girl was cast out into the snow by the very man who was supposed to protect her. Just when it seemed she would be lost forever, a loyal German shepherd and a police officer stepped into her life, and what followed would change everything. What would you do if you saw a child abandoned like this? And tell me, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know. Wishing you a beautiful day filled with warmth and kindness. Winter lay heavy upon the small mountain town of Ashwood, a place tucked between pine-covered ridges in northern Vermont, where the snow came early and stayed late. On this particular evening, the air had a bitter edge, the kind that stung the skin and made every exhale curl into a plume of frost. The streets were lined with modest wooden houses, their roofs burdened under thick layers of snow, chimneys puffing lazy trails of smoke into the slate-gray sky. Street lamps glowed faintly, their halos swallowed by the steady swirl of snowflakes. Despite the cold beauty of the town, the night was tense, for grief had settled in Ashwood like another layer of frost after the funeral of a beloved woman whose absence left a child vulnerable to cruelty. Lily Harper, only 6 years old, stood at the threshold of her late mother's house, clutching a small, worn-out suitcase. Her appearance was frail, thin arms peeking out from the sleeves of a pale blue wool dress too light for the freezing night, long chestnut brown hair tangled by both neglect and the sharp wind, cheeks reddened not from warmth but from the sting of tears, her wide hazel eyes brimmed with confusion and fear. Just 1 week ago she had been nestled safely in her mother's embrace, soothed by lullabies, reassured by the rhythm of bedtime stories. Now, with her mother buried under the frozen ground, Lily faced the coldness of another kind, rejection. Her stepfather's anger thundered through the wooden halls like a storm that would not end. David Harper, a man of 40, once known in the town as steady and dependable, had allowed grief and alcohol to corrode him into something unrecognizable. Broad-shouldered with the frame of a man who had once labored honestly at carpentry, he now slumped with a bottle perpetually in hand, his striped green and yellow flannel shirt wrinkled, eyes bloodshot, stubble left unshaven across his jaw. He had been a kind presence in Lily's early years, but Sarah, Lily's mother, had been the anchor that steadied his better nature. When cancer took her, he fell adrift, and what remained was a man volatile, bitter, unable to look at Lily without seeing the reflection of the wife he had lost. His love had turned into something jagged, and his voice, once gentle, had become a roar echoing through walls and shattering the fragile calm of the house. The door swung open with a sharp crack, and David's voice, slurred by whiskey, cut through the night. "You're not my child," he bellowed, words rough and ragged. "You're nothing but a burden. Get out!" He shoved the small suitcase against Lily's chest, and the sudden force knocked her down onto the snow-packed steps. The suitcase burst open, scattering clothing across the yard. A small teddy bear, threadbare with one ear stitched back clumsily by Sarah years ago, rolled onto the icy ground. Lily scrambled to her knees, gathering her things with trembling hands, sobbing softly, begging in a thin, desperate voice. "Please, let me stay. I'll help. I'll study hard. I'll make porridge like Mama showed me." But the man who had once carried her on his shoulders now stood rigid, glaring as though her very presence accused him of past happiness. Standing just inside the doorway was another figure, Vanessa Blake, Sarah's cousin. A woman of 30 with golden curls that shimmered under the warm light of the house, lips painted in sharp red, and a form-fitting crimson dress that clung to her slender figure. She carried herself with elegance but also calculation, her pale blue eyes flickering with a hint of satisfaction at the chaos unfolding. Outwardly, she cooed softly, placing a hand on David's arm as though to calm him, whispering, "David, stop. You've had too much to drink. The poor child." Yet when her gaze fell on Lily, there was a flash of mockery, quickly veiled behind false pity. Vanessa had always lived in Sarah's shadow, envying her cousin's warmth and the genuine affection she inspired. Now, with Sarah gone, Vanessa had maneuvered herself closer to David under the guise of offering comfort, though her true motives reached into matters of inheritance and control. In the yard, neighbors lingered behind a leaning wooden fence, bundled in coats and scarves, whispering among themselves. Mrs. Thompson, a stout woman in her 60s with silver hair tucked under a wool cap, shook her head in dismay but did not step forward. Beside her, Mr. Dale, a retired postman, muttered that it wasn't their place. Fear of confrontation held them still, their breath fogging in the night air as they watched the small girl sobbing in the snow. David's face hardened further as Lily clutched the teddy bear to her chest, her small knuckles whitening against the worn fabric. "Shut up!" he roared, pointing a finger that trembled not with compassion, but with rage. "You're just like your mother, always dragging me back into the past. I won't carry this anymore." His words struck her harder than the shove. Lily's sobs broke into hiccups of panic as she tried to protest that she wasn't a burden, that she only wanted to help, but the man before her had no ears for innocence anymore. The snow swirled heavier, and the night deepened, and though the neighbors whispered uneasily, no one crossed the threshold. To them, the Harper home had become a fortress of bitterness, and not even pity could stir their courage. Lily, her small frame hunched over her scattered belongings, seemed almost swallowed by the snow, a fragile figure abandoned in the very place she had once called home. At that moment, the crunch of tires against icy gravel echoed from the road. A police SUV, headlights cutting through the veil of snow, slowed to a stop. The driver's door opened, and a tall figure stepped out. Officer Ethan Ward, 38 years old, carried the look of a man carved by years of service and quiet burdens. He stood broad-shouldered in his Navy winter patrol uniform, dark tactical boots crunching on the icy ground, his short brown hair flecked with gray at the temples, his hazel eyes keen and watchful, but shadowed with weariness from too many late shifts. Ethan had chosen the badge not for authority, but for responsibility, and though his manner was often quiet, his sense of duty was resolute. Orphaned young and raised in foster care, he had learned early what it meant to survive without a steady hand to guide him, and that old wound often surfaced when he saw children in distress. Beside him leapt down Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd partner. With a black and silver coat, thick against the cold, amber eyes sharp with intelligence, and a scar etched across one ear from a past skirmish with a suspect, Ranger moved with both power and grace. He was protective, yet gentle, a sentinel on 4 legs who never left Ethan's side. To strangers, Ranger could appear intimidating, his frame muscular and his bark thunderous, but to Ethan, he was family, a bond forged through years of trust and countless nights on patrol. Ethan's gaze fell upon the scene before him, a small child kneeling in the snow, suitcase splayed open, a teddy bear clutched in her arms, while a man loomed in the doorway with a bottle in hand and a woman in red lingered at his side. Ethan's steps quickened. "What's going on here?" he called, his voice steady, carrying the authority of his badge but softened with concern as his eyes met Lily's. She froze, her lips trembling, and Ranger padded forward, nose twitching, before lowering his head toward the child, pressing gently against her arm. Startled at first, Lily looked down at the dog, and the dam of her tears broke further. She buried her face in Ranger's fur, her sobs muffled against the warmth that radiated from the animal's steady body. Ethan crouched beside her, one knee sinking into the snow, and spoke low enough for only her to hear. "You're safe now," he said gently, his hazel eyes steady on hers. "No one is going to hurt you tonight." Behind them, David barked angrily about police interference, Vanessa's false soothing tones fluttering over his drunken outrage. But Ethan did not move his gaze away from Lily. Ranger's body formed a barrier between the child and the looming figures in the doorway. The snowfall thickened as though the sky itself wished to wrap the girl in silence, and in that moment, in the cold heart of Ashwood, the fragile thread of hope returned. And that was how the night ended. A child cast into the snow, neighbors too fearful to act, a stepfather consumed by grief and drink, a cousin cloaked in ambition, and a police officer with his loyal German shepherd stepping into the storm, ready to change the course of a life. Snow crunched under Ethan Ward's boots as he moved closer to the small figure crouched on the steps. The child's shoulders hunched as though the very cold wished to bury her. Ranger pressed forward with quiet certainty, his breath steaming in the icy air, his ears twitching with alertness, and his amber eyes fixed not on the drunken man in the doorway, but on the little girl trembling beneath him. Lily's sobs subsided into tiny hiccups, as she felt the warmth of the dog against her arm. It was the first living being since her mother's passing that had touched her with kindness. She buried her face deeper into the fur, muffling her grief while her stepfather barked drunken protests from the doorway. Ethan straightened slowly, his frame tall and steady in the blowing snow, his badge glinting faintly in the dull porch light. He looked at David with the even stare of a man who had dealt with drunks before, stern but not heated, firm without cruelty. "Sir," Ethan said, his voice calm but carrying, "this child is standing in the snow without a coat. That's neglect. Step back inside." David's response was a sharp laugh that rattled with bitterness. He swayed, half-empty bottle in his hand, his once proud shoulders now slumped forward like a man caving under invisible weight. "She's no child of mine," he roared, spit flashing in the lamplight. "She drags me down, just like her mother. Let her freeze for all I care." Vanessa Blake, standing beside him, laid a delicate hand on his arm again. She was striking in appearance, a woman of 30 whose carefully styled golden curls gleamed even in the dim porch light. She wore a crimson dress that clung to her figure despite the winter air, and her pale blue eyes moved with calculation. Her painted smile feigned concern, but the flicker of triumph glimmered beneath it. "David," she purred, her voice smooth and low, "you've said enough. Officer, forgive him. He's grieving." Her gaze slid past Ethan and down to Lily, and for the briefest instant her lips curved in a mocking smirk before snapping back into an expression of false pity. She tilted her head, her tone shifting to one dripping with artificial sweetness. "Poor child, so lost without her mother. But surely you see, officer, he's not himself. You wouldn't make trouble for a family in mourning." The neighbors behind the fence murmured more loudly now. Mrs. Thompson clutched her scarf tighter, her gray brows knitting together as she whispered to Mr. Dale. "The girl needs help," she muttered. Mr. Dale shifted uneasily, his wrinkled face caught between cowardice and conscience. He was a thin man in his 70s, with a permanent stoop from years of delivering mail along icy streets. He adjusted his cap nervously but still did not move from behind the fence. Their hesitation painted the wider truth of the town. Everyone saw, everyone whispered, but few would act. Lily's tears dripped silently. Onto Ranger's coat, her small fingers gripping the fur, as though she feared the world might peel him away too. Ethan crouched once more, meeting her wide hazel eyes. Up close, he saw the streaks of dirt across her cheeks, the scuffed shoes not fit for winter, the raw knuckles of a child who had spent more time doing chores than holding crayons. "Hey," he said softly, hazel eyes steady on hers. "My name's Ethan. This here is Ranger. You're safe while we're here." Ranger lowered his head further, his scarred ear twitching as he let out a low, reassuring rumble, almost a hum of comfort. Lily managed to nod, though her lips quivered, and whispered, He pushed me out." Ethan's chest tightened. Memories of his own childhood flickered, nights at foster homes, no one stepping between him and the cold, no one telling him he mattered. He would not let this girl be another shadow, swallowed by neglect. David's voice rose again, hoarse and cutting. "Get away from her! She's nothing but trouble. You don't know what it's like, officer. You don't know what it's like to lose everything." His words slurred, but Ethan caught the truth beneath them. Grief twisted into poison. Vanessa stroked David's arm, her smile practiced. "You need rest, David. Don't fight with the officer. Let him take her for tonight if he insists. Tomorrow we can sort it out properly." Her words were velvet, but her eyes flashed sharp. She wanted Lily gone, not because she cared for David's peace, but because the girl stood in the way of her schemes. Ethan read the intent as easily as one reads frost patterns on glass. At that moment, another figure appeared. Officer Maria Lopez, 34, Ethan's colleague, who had been on the far end of patrol. She strode quickly up the walk, her boots cutting through snow with confidence. Maria was of medium height, with olive-toned skin, dark hair pulled into a neat bun under her winter cap, and sharp dark eyes that missed little. Her personality was straightforward, her tone often blunt, but beneath the steel lay a heart that cared deeply for children. She had grown up in a crowded immigrant household where her mother worked 2 jobs and her older brothers often fell into trouble. Maria had sworn that when she wore the badge, she would be the voice for those who could not speak. She glanced at Ethan, then at the child huddled against Ranger, and her jaw tightened. "What's going on here?" she asked crisply. Ethan answered with a glance, and Maria's eyes narrowed on David. "Sir, step back inside before I place you under arrest for child endangerment." David bristled but swayed too heavily to resist with much force. Vanessa whispered urgently in his ear, her hand gripping his sleeve, urging him to retreat. He muttered something incoherent and stumbled backward into the house, though his glare lingered on the child as though she had betrayed him simply by existing. Vanessa followed, casting one last sharp look toward Lily before shutting the door. The slam reverberated across the yard. Silence followed, broken only by the sound of the wind whipping loose snow into eddies around the porch. Ethan exhaled slowly, then turned his focus back to Lily. "Come on," he said gently, gathering her small suitcase and brushing off the snow. He offered his gloved hand, but Lily clung instead to Ranger's fur, her small body pressed close to the dog. Ranger accepted the weight, standing still as a pillar, his eyes soft yet alert. Ethan didn't force her. "That's fine," he murmured. "Hold on to Ranger. He's stronger than me anyway." For the first time, a faint, fleeting smile ghosted across Lily's lips. It vanished quickly, but Ethan caught it, and it was enough. He knew then that hope had not been completely stolen from her. Maria stepped closer, lowering her voice. "We'll need to report this officially. CPS should be involved." Ethan nodded, but kept his gaze on Lily. "We'll take care of the paperwork later. Right now, she needs warmth." Maria's eyes softened, though her words stayed brisk. "I'll circle back after patrol." She gave Lily a quick nod, her stern face gentling for just a moment. "You're safe now, sweetheart?" With that, she turned back to the street, her figure fading into the swirling snow. Ethan scooped up the teddy bear from the snow and handed it carefully to Lily. "Here," he said. "Looks like he's been through a lot too, kind of like us." Lily pressed the bear to her chest, nodding quickly, as if afraid it might be taken away. She did not speak, but her eyes followed Ethan now, not only Ranger. That trust, fragile as a snowflake, was forming. Ethan stood, Ranger steady beside the girl, the cold biting sharper around them. Behind the fence, Mrs. Thompson whispered to Mr. Dale, "Maybe things will change now." Mr. Dale shifted his weight and gave the smallest of nods. Perhaps they had both been waiting for someone else to act first, now that someone had. The night in Ashwood remained bitter and cold, but on those steps, for one child and one officer with his dog, something warmer had begun. And so the chapter closed not with the cruelty of David's rejection, nor the scheming of Vanessa's whispers, but with the arrival of Ethan and Ranger standing as a shield, Lily clinging to them in the storm, the beginning of a bond that would alter the path of every life entwined in that winter night. The drive from the Harper house to the police station cut through the sleeping town of Ashwood, headlights bouncing against banks of snow piled high along the roadside. Inside the SUV, the heater hummed low, filling the silence with a steady warmth that contrasted with the storm raging outside. Lily sat buckled into the back seat, clutching her threadbare teddy bear, her hazel eyes fixed on the blur of snowflakes against the window. She was small enough that the seatbelt crossed awkwardly against her shoulder, her boots dangling above the floor mats, and her pale cheeks still blotched with tear stains. Ranger sat beside her, his large frame filling most of the space, his black and silver fur rising and falling with each slow breath. His amber eyes occasionally flicked toward the girl, then back to the window, as though he were watching both the storm and her sorrow. Ethan Ward kept his hand steady on the wheel, though inside him, old ghosts stirred. He had seen children in distress before, on raids, in homes where parents had chosen needles or bottles over responsibility. But this one struck differently. Maybe it was the way she clung to Ranger, or maybe it was the faint trace of Sarah Harper in the shape of the child's eyes. He had known Sarah briefly years ago, when she organized food drives at the local church. She had been a slim woman with long auburn hair, gentle eyes, and a voice that carried warmth even in crowded rooms. People remembered her kindness because she gave it freely. Losing her had cut Ashwood in ways people rarely admitted aloud, and Ethan suspected David had drowned not just his grief, but his guilt in liquor. Ethan's chest tightened as he glanced in the mirror and saw Lily stroking Ranger's scarred ear, whispering words too quiet to catch. The police station stood near the center of town, a squat brick building with frosted windows glowing faintly under the streetlights. The lot was empty save for Ethan's SUV and one other patrol car belonging to Officer Jenkins, a young man barely 26 with sandy hair and a round, boyish face that still carried the awkwardness of someone trying to look older than he was. Jenkins was earnest and diligent, but often overly eager, quick to prove himself even in mundane situations. He stepped out of the building as Ethan parked, pulling his coat tighter around his lanky frame. "Rough night?" Jenkins asked, his voice carrying both curiosity and unease as he caught sight of Lily stepping out with Ranger, nudging protectively at her side. Ethan didn't offer details, only a firm nod. "We'll talk later. Get some coffee going." Jenkins, sensing the gravity in Ethan's tone, nodded quickly and retreated inside. The lobby of the station was modest. Old linoleum floors, a row of worn chairs, and a bulletin board filled with flyers for church suppers, lost pets, and community events. The hum of the radiator filled the space. Ethan led Lily to a seat near the heater. She perched quietly, holding her bear against her chest, as if afraid someone might take it. Ranger sat directly beside her, his body angled protectively, his tail sweeping the floor in slow, deliberate arcs. Ethan removed his coat, the fatigue of the night catching in his shoulders, then crouched down in front of her. "Lily," he said gently, his hazel eyes searching hers, "I need you to know something. When I was about your age, I didn't have a safe place either. My parents, they weren't there. I grew up in a foster home. There were nights when it felt like nobody could see me, like I was invisible." He paused, his throat tightening slightly at the memory of bunk beds and cold dinners, of being one of too many kids in a house that never felt like his own. "But I wasn't invisible to everyone. There was a woman, my foster mother, who gave me an old jacket when winter hit. She said, 'You're worth keeping warm.' It wasn't much, but it told me I mattered." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "And I want you to know, you matter too. Right now, it might feel like the whole world is against you. But I see you. Ranger sees you." Lily's lips trembled, and for the first time since Ethan had arrived, she whispered, "He hates me." "David." He said, "I'm like Mama," dragging him back. Ethan shook his head firmly. "You're not the reason for his pain. Sometimes adults break in ways children can't fix. That's not your burden. It never should have been." Ranger leaned forward, resting his muzzle gently on Lily's lap, and she buried her fingers into his fur. The steady warmth of the dog seemed to anchor her, and she whispered, "He feels safe." Jenkins returned with a cup of steaming cocoa, balanced nervously in his hands. He wasn't used to children in the station, and his round face flushed as he handed the mug over. "Careful, it's hot," he mumbled. Lily accepted it with both hands, her small fingers trembling as she took a tentative sip. Jenkins glanced at Ethan as if asking silently whether he'd done the right thing. Ethan gave a small nod, which made the younger officer straighten his back with a flicker of pride. Later, when Lily was wrapped in a station blanket and Ranger curled protectively at her feet, Ethan sat at his desk, scribbling notes in his worn leather notebook. He wrote down her condition, the events as they unfolded, but his eyes often drifted to the child across the room. She had stopped crying, though her shoulders still rose with the faint tremors of exhaustion. The way she leaned against Ranger as if he were both wall and pillow stirred something in Ethan that went deeper than duty. Through the window, snow still fell steadily, muffling the town. Somewhere beyond those flakes lay Vanessa Blake, whispering schemes into David Harper's ear, twisting his grief into advantage. Ethan didn't know the full of it yet, but he knew enough. Lily was in danger, not just of neglect, but of being erased from her own home, and he would not allow it. When the clock struck 2 in the morning, Ethan rose and draped his coat gently over Lily's shoulders where she dozed. Her face softened in sleep, the faint traces of a smile tugging at her lips as her hand remained curled in Ranger's fur. Ethan let out a quiet breath, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of a promise forming, not one written in ink or duty, but one forged in the quiet vow of a man who had once been invisible himself. He would not let this child slip into the cracks, not while he and Ranger still drew breath. And so, the night closed within the modest walls of Ashwood Station, a child, a dog, and a weary officer bound together by loss, but slowly stitching the first threads of trust. Ashwood's nights always had a heaviness to them, but the tavern on Birch Street carried its own special kind of weight. The Timberline Bar, an old establishment with warped wooden floors and walls lined with the mounted heads of deer and elk, smelled of whiskey soaked into the beams and cigarettes that had never quite left, despite the smoking ban. Yellow light spilled dimly from crooked lamps, catching the swirl of dust and smoke in the air. Patrons hunched over tables, their laughter low and sharp, the sound of glasses clinking mixing with the shuffle of boots on sticky planks. At a corner table sat David Harper, his eyes bleary and red-rimmed, his broad frame sagging like a house left without beams to hold it. His flannel shirt was stained at the cuffs, his hair unkempt, and his hands shook as he cradled a half-drained tumbler of amber liquid. He had once been a capable man, proud of his craft as a carpenter, the type neighbors trusted to repair porches or mend a barn door. But tonight his body was hunched with defeat, and his voice, when it came, was rough from drink and grief. Across from him leaned Vanessa Blake, the crimson of her dress like a flame in the dim light. Her golden curls cascaded down her shoulders, carefully arranged though she feigned a casual toss now and then. Her pale blue eyes glinted like ice, cold and purposeful, even as her lips carried a practiced softness. She reached across the table, sliding her manicured fingers against David's trembling hand. "David," she said in a tone low and honeyed, "you cannot let the past chain you. Sarah is gone, and you're drowning yourself for nothing. The house, the accounts, everything, it's too much for you alone. But with my help, you won't have to carry it." David's jaw tightened, his eyes drifting toward the bottle. "She won't stop haunting me. That little girl. Every time I see her face, it's Sarah's all over again." His words cracked on Sarah's name. Vanessa tilted her head, her expression flickering with just enough sympathy to mask the glint of ambition. "Then let her go, David. Sign over guardianship. The law will not ask questions if you make it clear you can't raise her. And as for the house, the assets, you let me handle the paperwork. In a month, it will all be peaceful." She emphasized the word as though peace meant profit. The bartender, a burly man named Carl Simmons, moved with practiced indifference behind the counter, though his eyes were sharp under his thick brows. Carl was in his late 50s, his build still solid from years of hauling kegs, his hair cropped short and graying, his beard trimmed but uneven. A man of few words, Carl had grown up in Ashwood when mills still thrived, and the hardness of those years clung to him. He wiped glasses slowly, his gaze darting to David and Vanessa often, not liking the way her body leaned too close, her voice too slick. But Carl had seen enough in his bar to know trouble when it brewed, and though his exterior was gruff, he had a quiet code. He kept eyes open and mouth shut until it mattered. In another corner, unnoticed, a woman sat alone at a small table near the jukebox. Officer Maria Lopez had swapped her uniform for plain clothes, dark jeans, a wool sweater under a thick jacket, her hair tied in a loose bun, the softness of her face blending her into the shadows. Maria had a notepad tucked discreetly in her lap, and her dark eyes, steady and alert, flicked between the couple and her drink. She had grown up in hardship, watching her own father fall prey to schemes not unlike Vanessa's. The memory of her mother working double shifts to keep food on the table had carved steel into Maria's character. So when she saw Vanessa's hand slide over a folder of papers, the outline of signatures already marked, Maria's jaw set. Vanessa pulled a pen from her purse, pressing it toward David. "One signature," she murmured. "Then all this noise goes away. The girl will be someone else's problem, and you, finally free." David stared at the pen, his fingers hovering, sweat beading at his temple. His conscience flickered, a battle between sorrow and weakness. He whispered, "Sarah asked me. She asked me to protect her." His voice cracked. Vanessa leaned closer, her perfume strong, her words sharp against his ear. "And look at what it's doing to you. Sarah's gone, David. You can't keep promises to the dead." Maria's hand tightened on her pen, her heart thumping at the brazenness of the words. She tilted her phone under the table, the faint glow of the camera lens catching Vanessa's push, her whisper, the pen against the paper. At the bar, Carl raised his head. He recognized Maria. He'd seen her in uniform often enough, and though he said nothing, he caught her eye briefly. That was his way of signaling. "I see it too. Maria gave the faintest nod, returning her gaze to the schemers. Meanwhile, a side door creaked open, and Mark Sullivan entered. Mark was in his early 40s, tall but hollow-faced, with thinning dark hair slicked back and sharp cheekbones that gave him a predatory air. His black coat hung loose on his lanky frame, and his gray eyes scanned the room before he slipped into the seat beside Vanessa. Mark was known in hushed tones around town as a fixer, the sort of man who handled dirty work for those who didn't want their hands stained. His smirk as he leaned toward David reeked of confidence. "You'll sign," he said quietly, voice low and raspy from years of smoke. "It's the easiest way. Trust me, I've handled worse." Vanessa smiled thinly, folding her hands as though in prayer, her posture poised. "See, David? Even Mark agrees. There's no reason to drag this misery longer." David's hand shook violently, the pen tapping the paper without writing. His face was pale, his lips pressed tight. He muttered, I just want it to stop." Vanessa's eyes gleamed with triumph. Maria's phone clicked once, faint but precise, capturing the tableau. Vanessa's hand pressing the paper, Mark looming, David wavering, pen hovering. The tavern door groaned again, and cold air swept through. A pair of late drinkers stumbled in, oblivious, laughing at some private joke. The sound jarred David, who dropped the pen as though it burned him. He buried his face in his hands, groaning, "God, what am I doing?" Vanessa's smile faltered, but she quickly bent to retrieve the pen, pressing it back into his hand with force disguised as encouragement. Maria's eyes narrowed. She scribbled 2 words in her notepad. Enough gathered. Then she slipped her phone back into her pocket. The time to intervene would come soon, but not tonight. Tonight was about shadows, about listening and catching whispers that would become chains of evidence later. Carl Simmons, polishing glasses, watched the officer stand quietly and exit, her figure swallowed by the swirl of snow outside. He returned his gaze to the corner where Vanessa leaned closer to David, Mark smirking like a wolf circling prey. Carl sighed, setting the glass down with a thud. Trouble was here, and he had no doubt it would come crashing down sooner rather than later. And so, the night ended in Timberline Bar, with David drowning in whiskey, Vanessa weaving her net tighter, Mark circling like a hawk, and Maria slipping silently into the storm, with proof in her pocket. Shadows had been drawn, and though the town still slept, the battle for Lily Harper's fate had already begun. The storm had quieted by the time Ethan turned onto the narrow lane leading to his home. Ashwood lay hushed beneath its blanket of snow, chimneys puffing faint trails of smoke into the night, windows glowing like watchful eyes across the valley. His house stood at the edge of town, a modest 1-story with weathered clapboard siding and a sagging porch that bore the marks of too many winters. It was not large, nor particularly well kept, but its windows shone with the honest warmth of a man who tried, despite long shifts and loneliness, to keep a roof steady above his head. The snow piled against the railings and steps, crunching under his boots as he carried Lily's suitcase and held the door open for her. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pine wood and old coffee. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner, radiating heat into the small living room. The walls were lined with a few framed photographs, mostly landscapes Ethan had taken on rare fishing trips, and one of his police academy graduation, where he stood younger, cleaner shaven, and less burdened. The furnishings were simple: a worn couch, a bookshelf stacked with paperbacks and old case files, a quilt folded neatly on a chair. Ranger bounded in first, shaking the snow from his thick fur before trotting straight to the rug by the stove and lying down with a grunt of satisfaction. Lily stood just inside the doorway, clutching her teddy bear, her wide hazel eyes scanning the room, as though she were stepping into a world both strange and fragile. Her pale face was streaked with the remnants of dried tears, and the hem of her wool dress was still damp with snow. Ethan crouched to meet her gaze. "It's not much," he admitted, voice gentle, "but it's safe. That's what matters tonight." She nodded slightly, gripping the bear tighter, then slowly stepped inside. At that moment, a knock rattled against the doorframe. Ethan turned to see Margaret Hillman, his neighbor, standing bundled in a thick brown overcoat, her head wrapped in a knitted scarf, snowflakes clinging to her shoulders. Margaret was 72, short and stout, with cheeks weathered pink by years of wind and sun. Her eyes, a watery blue, were sharp despite her age, and she had a way of speaking her mind without apology. Margaret had lived in Ashwood all her life, raising 3 sons who had long since moved away. Widowed for over a decade, she carried both the loneliness of an empty house and the fierce determination of a woman who had survived everything the mountain town had thrown at her. She held a pie tin in one hand, steam rising from the vents in the crust. "I saw your SUV pull in," she said briskly, her voice firm but not unkind. Figured the child would need something warm in her belly. Apple pie, fresh out of the oven. She pushed past Ethan without waiting for an invitation, her boots stamping snow onto the mat. Margaret set the pie on the counter, removed her gloves, and turned her attention to Lily. Her stern face softened, her wrinkles folding into something gentler. "Well, aren't you a little bird?" she murmured. "You look half frozen. Come here, love." She reached out, and though Lily hesitated at first, the smell of baked apples and cinnamon seemed to ease her. Slowly she allowed Margaret to smooth her tangled hair. Ethan leaned against the counter, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Margaret had always been like this, brusque with adults, tender with children. After her husband died in a logging accident 20 years earlier, she had thrown herself into caring for her garden, her church, and any child in town who needed a hot meal or a scolding. Hardship had not soured her. It had sharpened her compassion into action. While Margaret cut slices of pie and set them on chipped plates, Ranger nudged closer to Lily, his amber eyes steady, his scarred ear twitching as though he could sense her hesitation. The girl lowered herself onto the rug beside him, her teddy bear on her lap, and tentatively reached for his thick fur. This time, instead of just holding him, she leaned against his side, her small body pressed into his warmth. Ranger's tail swept the floor once, then again, a silent sign of acceptance. Lily whispered something into his fur, words only the dog could hear. Margaret caught the moment and glanced at Ethan, her eyes narrowing knowingly. "That dog's worth more than half the people in this town," she muttered. Ethan chuckled softly. "He's saved me more times than I can count. Seems he knows who needs saving next." The clock ticked past midnight as the little kitchen grew warm with the smell of pie and the sound of plates clinking. Margaret fussed over Lily, urging her to eat, praising her for finishing even small bites. Lily's shoulders relaxed fraction by fraction, her face no longer pinched so tightly with fear. Ethan watched the transformation quietly, feeling the edges of his own fatigue soften. He remembered nights when no one had stood over him with pie or comfort, and the thought only strengthened his resolve. When Margaret finally bundled herself to leave, she gave Ethan a look both sharp and kind. "You take care of her," she said firmly, adjusting her scarf. "She's too small for the world she's been given." Her gaze flicked to Lily, who was now curled against Ranger on the rug, half asleep, crumbs on her lips. "I'll check in tomorrow. Bring soup. Don't argue." Ethan nodded, his voice low. "Thank you, Margaret." She waved him off. "Don't thank me. Thank your own conscience for doing what's right." Then she disappeared into the night, leaving warmth lingering behind her. Ethan knelt by the stove, gently spreading a blanket over Lily, where she lay with Ranger curled protectively beside her. The dog's amber eyes lifted to Ethan's for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them, a vow of guardianship. Ethan rested, his hand briefly on Ranger's head, then looked back at the child. She was asleep now, her lips parted slightly, her hand still tangled in the German shepherd's fur, as though afraid he might vanish in the night. The modest house had never felt so full. Outside, the storm had buried Ashwood in silence, but inside, for the first time in days, Lily slept without fear. Ethan leaned back against the wall, fatigue pressing down, but peace spreading through his chest. He whispered into the quiet, more to himself than anyone else. "You're safe now." And so, the night closed on the Hillman pie cooling on the counter, the neighbor's footsteps fading into snow, and a little girl curled beside a dog who would not let her face the darkness alone. The Ashwood County Courthouse stood at the center of town like an aging sentinel, its stone columns streaked from years of rain and snow, its windows fogged with condensation in the winter air. On that morning, the square outside bustled with muted energy, people in wool coats and scarves bracing against the cold, boots crunching on icy pavement. Inside, the courthouse smelled faintly of varnish, old paper, and coffee. The long wooden benches were already filled with curious townsfolk whispering about the Harper case, a story that had traveled fast through Ashwood's narrow streets. Ethan Ward walked through the double doors with Lily at his side. He wore his uniform pressed and formal, the navy fabric crisp against his broad shoulders, his badge gleaming beneath the lights. But it wasn't his presence that drew attention. It was the little girl clutching his hand with one fist and her teddy bear with the other. Lily was dressed in a simple gray sweater that Margaret had mended for her, a plaid skirt reaching below her knees, and boots that were slightly too big but warm. Her hazel eyes were wide with fear, her lips pressed tight as though one wrong sound might shatter her. Beside her padded ranger, his black and silver coat brushed clean, his scarred ear twitching as his amber eyes swept the room. The dog carried himself with a gravity that silenced even the whispers in the gallery. Seated near the front was Judge Helen Coleman, a woman in her late 50s with sharp cheekbones and silver hair cut short in a no-nonsense style. She had served in Ashwood for over 20 years and was known for a demeanor both strict and steady. Helen was tall, her posture erect as if carved from the bench itself, and though her gray eyes revealed little warmth, they carried fairness. A widow herself, she had once balanced her duties while raising 2 daughters alone, and though she rarely spoke of it, the memory shaped her intolerance for cruelty in her courtroom. At one table sat David Harper, his suit poorly fitted, his hair combed haphazardly as if he had attempted dignity, but failed. His face was pale, the wear of alcohol still evident in his sunken cheeks, though his eyes darted nervously to Lily. Next to him sat Peter Dawson, his attorney, a lean man in his 40s with slick black hair and a sharp hawk-like nose. Dawson wore a charcoal suit and wire-framed glasses that flashed when he tilted his head, his reputation being one of shrewd arguments often masking weak cases. Dawson's strategy was clear: undermine the child, sow doubt, and paint David as a grieving widower rather than a negligent guardian. Across the aisle sat Ethan with Lily, and next to them Maria Lopez, plainclothes today, but with her badge discreetly clipped to her belt. She carried a folder tucked under her arm, its contents organized meticulously, photos, notes, and recordings gathered from Timberline Bar. Maria's expression was firm, her dark eyes glinting with the steadiness of a woman who had seen manipulation before and would not let it thrive unchecked. Also present was Michael Turner, the prosecutor, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s with thinning sandy hair and a calm voice that carried authority. Turner had spent decades handling family cases, his even temperament and careful words often earning the trust of juries. He wore a brown suit, his tie knotted neatly, and spoke gently to Lily before the hearing began, promising her she would not be alone. The bailiff, a stout man named Henry Locke, with a thick mustache and steady baritone, called the room to order. Everyone rose as Judge Coleman entered, her robe flowing, her expression unreadable. "You may be seated," she intoned, her voice carrying across the wooden chamber. Papers shuffled, murmurs hushed, and the proceedings began. Turner rose first, introducing the case: a child cast from her home, an intoxicated guardian, and evidence of coercion by another relative. His voice was calm but firm, painting the outline of neglect without theatrics. He nodded to Maria, who stepped forward and placed a USB drive into the clerk's hands. "These are recordings taken at Timberline Bar," she said clearly, her voice steady. "They capture Vanessa Blake pressing Mr. Harper to sign away guardianship and property while intoxicated." The judge raised a brow and nodded for them to be entered into evidence. A faint murmur rippled through the benches, quickly silenced by Helen's sharp glance. Dawson rose next, his smile thin, his tone edged with disdain. "Your Honor, we must remember that grief does strange things to men. My client is not a monster. He is a widower, broken and vulnerable, manipulated by outsiders. And this child," he gestured at Lily, "she is 6 years old, impressionable. Memories at that age are fragile, unreliable. We must be careful before we let a child's fantasies dictate law." His words caused Lily to shrink slightly against Ethan's side, her fingers clutching the fur on Ranger's back. Judge Coleman's gray eyes softened fractionally as they flicked toward the girl. "We will hear her testimony," she said evenly. The courtroom stilled. Ethan bent down, his voice low, his hazel eyes steady. You don't have to be afraid. Just tell the truth. That's all. Ranger pressed closer, his tail brushing against her leg like a steady rhythm. Lily nodded, her lips trembling. Turner guided her gently to the stand. She climbed up with Ethan's help, the teddy bear clutched tightly in her hands. Ranger moved to sit directly beneath her, his amber eyes fixed on the room as though daring anyone to cause harm. The clerk swore her in with careful, simple words. Her small voice wavered, but she whispered, "Yes." Turner asked gently, "Lily, can you tell us what happened the night Officer Ward found you?" She bit her lip, her hazel eyes glistening. "He told me I wasn't his child. He pushed me out. My clothes fell in the snow. I begged him not to drink anymore. I was scared." Her voice cracked, and she hugged the teddy bear tighter. The gallery was silent, the air heavy. Dawson rose for cross-examination, his steps precise, his glasses glinting under the lights. "Lily," he said smoothly, "isn't it true that sometimes you get scared of shadows? That you've had bad dreams since your mother passed? Could it be that you imagine parts of this?" Lily flinched, her small body stiffening, her eyes darting toward Ethan. Ranger gave a low rumble, not loud enough to be a bark, but enough to turn every head. The judge's gavel tapped once, sharp. "Control your questions, Mr. Dawson." Lily drew in a shaky breath. She looked down at Ranger, then at Ethan, who gave her a single nod. Her hazel eyes turned back to the lawyer. "It wasn't a dream," she whispered. "It was real. He told me I was a burden. I heard it." The simplicity of her words carried more weight than any argument. The judge leaned forward slightly, her silver hair catching the light. "Thank you, Lily," she said, her voice gentler now. "You've done very well." She gestured for her to step down. Lily hurried back to Ethan, pressing against his side, Ranger immediately shifting to guard her once more. And so, the morning closed on the first hearing. Maria's evidence entered, Turner's steady hand guiding the case, Dawson's sharp tactics failing to unsettle the girl, and Lily's quiet bravery echoing across the chamber. Ranger lay at her feet, eyes unblinking, the living shield between a child and the storm still brewing around her. The second day of the hearing dawned colder than the first. The courthouse steps were slick with ice, salt scattered in white patches across the stone. Townsfolk gathered in thicker numbers now, the story having spread like wildfire. Whispers about the drunk stepfather, the scheming cousin, the little girl who had stood up before the judge. The wooden benches inside were filled long before the gavel struck, faces both sympathetic and skeptical, leaning forward to catch every word. David Harper entered with shoulders hunched, a suit wrinkled from being slept in, his tie loosened as if strangling him. The man looked older than his 40 years, the lines of grief and drink carving deep trenches into his face. His pale green eyes darted restlessly, unable to meet Lily's across the aisle. He sat with trembling hands folded together, the air of a man torn apart by the echoes of his own mistakes. Vanessa Blake, in stark contrast, was polished to perfection. Her golden curls gleamed under the courthouse lights, her crimson dress replaced by a tailored navy suit that suggested false professionalism. Pearls adorned her ears, and her pale blue eyes scanned the room with restless calculation. She sat beside Peter Dawson, whispering often into his ear, her lips curving in a smile too sharp to be comforting. Judge Helen Coleman presided again, her silver hair neat, her expression unreadable. The bailiff Henry Locke called the court to order, and the air thickened into silence. Michael Turner, steady as ever, rose with a folder of documents, his sandy hair catching the light. His voice was calm but resolute. "Your Honor, yesterday this court heard testimony from the child, Lily Harper. Today we present further evidence of manipulation and coercion against Mr. Harper by Ms. Vanessa Blake." Maria Lopez stepped forward, plain clothes as before, a gray blazer over her frame, dark eyes sharp with determination. She carried a stack of photographs and a transcript printed from her recordings at Timberline Bar. She spoke with clip precision. "These images were taken on the night in question. They show Ms. Blake pushing legal documents toward Mr. Harper while he was visibly intoxicated. On the recording, she states explicitly, 'Sarah is gone, David. You can't keep promises to the dead.'" Gasps rippled across the gallery. Vanessa's painted smile faltered for the first time. though she leaned toward Dawson, whispering urgently. Turner continued, his tone firm but not theatrical. We submit this as clear evidence of undue influence, designed not to protect the child, but to strip Mr. Harper of assets while discarding Lily Harper's welfare entirely. Dawson rose, his glasses flashing, his nose sharp in profile as he sneered. Objection, Your Honor. These are casual conversations in a private setting. My client, Mr. Harper, was grieving and confused. To place weight on drunken ramblings is irresponsible. Judge Coleman raised, one brow, her gray eyes cold. Overruled, we will hear the full recording. The clerk played the audio, and the bar's low hum filled the courtroom. Clinking glasses, Vanessa's honeyed whisper, David's faltering protests, Mark Sullivan's rasp urging him to sign. The words hung heavy, undeniable. Mark Sullivan himself sat in the back row, summoned by subpoena. In his early 40s, his lanky frame seemed shrunken today, his slicked hair damp with sweat. He avoided everyone's eyes, staring at the floor as the recording played. His predatory smirk was gone, replaced by twitching fingers that tapped nervously against his knee. As the final words echoed, Vanessa's coaxing, "Sign, and you will be free," the silence in the room thickened. All eyes turned toward David, whose face had gone ashen, his lips parted, his breath shallow. For the first time in months, clarity cut through the haze of alcohol and grief. He remembered Sarah's last words in the hospital bed, her voice weak but firm. "Promise me you'll look after her." The memory struck him like a hammer. He lowered his face into his hands, a muffled groan escaping. When he lifted his head again, tears streaked down his cheeks. His green eyes, bloodshot but raw with truth, turned toward Lily. She sat close to Ethan, Ranger curled protectively at her feet, her small hands clutching the teddy bear. David's voice broke as he spoke. "I was wrong." His words carried across the chamber, husky but clear. "I let myself drown, and I let her down. I let them tell me she was a burden, when she's the only piece of Sarah I have left." Vanessa stiffened, her hand jerking toward Dawson's sleeve, but David shoved the papers away from him. "I abandoned my little girl," he said, louder now, trembling. "Sarah asked me to protect her, and I failed. But I see it now. I was blind. It was you." He turned sharply toward Vanessa, his face twisted with anguish. "You whispered poison into me. You wanted the house, the accounts. You used my grief. You—" His words dissolved into another sob. Judge Coleman's gavel struck. "Order in the court." The murmurs rose and fell until silence returned. The judge's eyes softened for a fleeting moment as she looked at David. "Mr. Harper, your words will be entered into record. This court acknowledges your admission." Vanessa tried to recover, her voice dripping sugar. "He's confused, Your Honor. He's being manipulated now by others. Surely—" But Maria cut in, her voice sharp as steel. "Manipulation? Ms. Blake, you were recorded instructing him to abandon his child. We will pursue charges for fraud and exploitation." The gallery buzzed, heads turning, whispers sharp. Vanessa's smile cracked, her pale eyes darting in every direction as though searching for escape. Even Dawson shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie. Lily, still small and trembling, peered over the teddy bear at her. Stepfather. For the first time, his eyes met hers without anger. His face was streaked with regret, raw and broken. But behind it flickered something that had been lost. Recognition. He mouthed two words, silent but unmistakable. "I'm sorry." Ethan felt Lily shift against his side. Her tiny fingers brushed Ranger's fur, her hazel eyes misted with tears, but she whispered just loud enough for Ethan to hear. "He saw me this time." Ethan's chest tightened, his jaw firm as he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Ranger let out a quiet huff, his amber gaze unblinking at the man across the aisle. And so, the day ended with the tide turning. David Harper, once consumed by denial, finally confessing his failure. Maria Lopez laying evidence bare, and Vanessa Blake's polished mask, cracking under the weight of truth. The storm had begun to break, but the reckoning was only just beginning. The courthouse emptied slowly that afternoon, the heavy doors creaking open to release streams of townsfolk into the square. The snow had stopped falling, and a pale winter sun gleamed weakly over the rooftops. its light catching the icy branches of the leafless maples. For the first time in weeks, Ashwood felt like it was breathing. Yet inside the chamber, the air still carried the weight of what had been spoken. Judge Coleman had not issued a final ruling, but her words had been clear. Lily Harper would remain under protective custody, with Officer Ethan Ward serving as temporary guardian until the investigation was complete. The decision landed like a stone dropped in a pond, its ripples reaching across the town, pulling people out of silence. As Ethan led Lily down the courthouse steps, Ranger trotting loyally at her side, they were stopped by Margaret Hillman, bundled in her thick coat, with a scarf wrapped high against the wind. Her blue eyes, sharp but softened now, looked at Lily. "You did well, little bird," she said, her voice quivering with restrained pride. She pressed a knitted hat into the child's hands. "Made this last night. Keep it close." Lily smiled faintly, pulling the hat over her messy chestnut hair, and whispered, "Thank you." Margaret reached down to pat Ranger's head before disappearing into the crowd. Other townsfolk gathered, their faces a mix of guilt and relief. Mr. Dale, the retired postman with his bent back, shuffled closer. His wrinkled hands gripped the brim of his cap as he muttered, "I should have spoken sooner, officer. I should have knocked that night." His voice cracked. Ethan put a hand on the man's shoulder. "You're here now. That matters." Dale nodded, tears catching in his faded eyes. Behind him, a young mother with 2 children offered a small bag of groceries, murmuring that Lily could use them more than she. An older man slipped a wool blanket into Ethan's hands without a word. It seemed the town, having watched in silence, now rushed to make amends. Inside the courthouse, David Harper lingered, sitting alone on a bench outside the chamber. His suit looked rumpled, his broad hands hanging between his knees. The haze of liquor no longer clouded his face, replaced instead with a pallor of shame. His pale green eyes were fixed on the floorboards, as though he were afraid to lift them. For the first time in years, his jawline no longer set in anger, but in regret. Maria Lopez approached, her gray blazer draped across one arm. Her dark eyes softened, though her tone remained firm. "Mr. Harper," she said evenly, "confession is one step. The rest is work, long and hard. You'll need to show this court and your daughter that your words aren't just air." David nodded mutely. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "How do I start?" Maria studied him for a long moment before replying. "There's a support group at the Methodist Church, every Tuesday night. You'll go, and if you mean what you said, you'll keep going. No excuses." She didn't wait for his reply, only placed a pamphlet in his hand and walked away, leaving him staring at the folded paper like it was a lifeline. Later that evening, Ethan drove Lily and Ranger back to his small house on the edge of town. The air inside smelled of wood smoke and pie from Margaret's earlier visit, a comforting scent that clung to the quilt-draped chairs and the iron stove glowing orange. Lily settled onto the rug, with Ranger curling close, her hazel eyes watching the fire, as if mesmerized. She looked smaller than ever, her body framed by the dog's protective form. Ethan sat at the table, papers spread before him, temporary custody forms, notes from Turner, a schedule for child services visits. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but the sight of Lily curled by the stove stirred something deep inside. He had taken oaths before, to uphold the law, to protect the weak, to serve his community. But this felt different. This was not a uniform's duty. It was a man's promise. A knock at the door broke the stillness. Ethan opened it to find Pastor Samuel Green, a tall man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and spectacles perched on his nose. His frame was lean, his back still straight despite the years, and his dark overcoat was dusted with snow. Pastor Green had lived in Ashwood nearly all his life, known for his quiet wisdom and a voice that soothed both weddings and funerals. He had married Sarah to David years ago, and his presence now carried the weight of memory. "Evening, Ethan," the pastor said softly. "I came to see the child, and you." He stepped inside, his gaze falling on Lily. She looked up from the rug, clutching her teddy bear tighter. The pastor lowered himself slowly to one knee, his tall frame folding with surprising grace. "Lily," he said, his tone tender, "I knew your mother well. She had a heart that gathered everyone around her. I see her in your eyes." The words cracked the dam inside Lily. Tears welled up, spilling silently down her cheeks as she leaned against Ranger. The pastor reached out but did not touch her, allowing the dog to remain her barrier. "You are not alone, child," he murmured. "This town failed you once. We will not again." Ethan swallowed hard, his hazel eyes fixed on the fire. Pastor Green stood, placing a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Guardianship is more than papers. It's sacrifice. You already know this, son, but know also, you're not alone." He left soon after, his tall frame disappearing into the snowy dusk, leaving warmth in his wake. That night, as Lily drifted to sleep wrapped in a quilt, Ranger curled tightly at her side. Ethan sat at his desk and filled out the last form with slow, deliberate strokes. His hand trembled slightly, but his resolve was steady. Temporary guardian. The words stamped on the page were legal, but to him, they were sacred. He glanced toward the child and the German shepherd, a fragile family bound together by circumstance, yet solidified by choice. Across town, in a dim church basement, David Harper sat on a folding chair among a circle of men. Their faces were etched with hardship, scars, tired eyes, trembling hands clutching coffee cups. The group leader, a burly man named Tom Ridley with tattoos crawling up his forearms and a steady voice, spoke simply. "We're here because we broke. But breaking isn't the end. It's where we start again." David lowered his eyes, his hand tightening on the pamphlet Maria had given him. He was unsure if he could be forgiven, unsure if he deserved to be. But for the first time in years, he was sober, listening, and willing to begin. And so, the day closed. The community that had once whispered from behind fences now stepped forward with knitted hats, groceries, and blankets. Ethan Ward signed papers that would make him Lily's guardian, at least for now. And David Harper, broken but stirred awake, took his first step into redemption. Spring arrived slowly in Ashwood, as if reluctant to loosen the grip of winter. Snow melted into rivulets that carved paths through the streets. The maple trees budded timidly, and the air carried the faint scent of thawing earth. On a Saturday morning, the town gathered at the park, where children in jackets ran across damp grass and older couples sat on benches, warming their hands around paper cups of coffee. The light was softer now, a golden hue spreading across the valley like a quiet promise. Ethan Ward stood near the picnic tables, his uniform traded for a flannel shirt and worn jeans, the stiffness of his role replaced by the comfort of an ordinary man. His short brown hair caught the sun, the streaks of gray at his temples gleaming faintly, his hazel eyes watchful but calm. Beside him sat Ranger, his black and silver coat brushed clean, amber eyes scanning the park with quiet vigilance. Children ran past, squealing, but gave the German shepherd a wide berth, awed by his size and scarred ear. Ranger lay steady, tail thumping occasionally when Lily's hand touched him. Lily Harper, 6 years old, wore a yellow dress Margaret had sewn from leftover fabric, its hem a little uneven but bright as sunlight. Her chestnut hair was pulled back with a ribbon, her hazel eyes clearer now, less haunted. She clutched her teddy bear in one arm, but not as tightly as before, more out of habit than desperation. For the first time, she looked less like a child surviving, and more like one beginning to live again. She leaned against Ranger, whispering secrets into his fur, her small fingers tracing the curve of his scarred ear. David Harper arrived later, his steps uncertain but sober. He wore a simple collared shirt, sleeves rolled up, his frame still broad but less slumped. His pale green eyes looked tired, but their fog had lifted. Weeks of group meetings at the church basement had begun to strip away the layers of denial. Tom Ridley, the group leader with tattooed arms and a firm but steady voice, had guided him into the discipline of confession and the long climb towards sobriety. David still carried shame like a second skin, but he was present, his hands no longer trembling from whiskey, his eyes no longer dulled. He stopped at the edge of the park, watching Lily laugh softly as Margaret Hillman handed her a slice of banana bread wrapped in napkin. Margaret, dressed in her usual sturdy overcoat despite the warmer air, fussed over the girl as if she were her own grandchild. Her sharp blue eyes softened at Lily's smile, and her stern voice carried affection. "Eat, little bird. You need strength if you're going to run with the other children." Lily obeyed, taking small bites, crumbs scattering onto Ranger's back. The dog bore it patiently, his tail sweeping the ground in rhythm. Pastor Samuel Green stood nearby, speaking with Ethan. The tall, gray-haired pastor wore a simple brown coat, spectacles perched low on his nose. His voice was calm, carrying the cadence of sermons long practiced. "She looks lighter already," he said, nodding toward Lily. "You've done more than paperwork, Ethan. You've given her a place where fear does not sleep." Ethan shook his head slightly. "It's Ranger. She trusts him first. I'm just following his lead." The pastor's smile was faint but knowing. Children know who their guardians are, and sometimes they choose better than adults ever could. As the afternoon waned, David gathered his courage and stepped forward. His boots sank slightly into the damp grass, his breath visible though the air was warming. Lily looked up as he approached, her hazel eyes widening. For a moment, silence stretched between them. David knelt slowly, his large hands resting on his knees, his voice quiet but steady. "Lily," he said, his throat tight, "I don't expect forgiveness yet, but I want you to know I've been going to meetings. Every week. I haven't had a drink since the hearing. It's not much, but it's a start. I want to change. For you, for Sarah, for myself." Lily clutched her teddy bear, her small fingers twisting the fabric. She looked at Ranger, then at Ethan, then back to the man kneeling before her. Her lips trembled. "You hurt me," she whispered. David's face twisted with pain, his pale green eyes filling with tears. "I know," he said hoarsely, "and I will carry that. But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." Ranger shifted, his amber eyes fixed on David. After a tense moment, he let out a quiet huff, lowering his head against Lily's lap, as if granting permission. Lily reached out slowly, her small hand brushing against her stepfather's sleeve. She didn't embrace him, but she didn't pull away either. For David, that tiny gesture was more grace than he deserved. His tears spilled freely as he bowed his head. The townsfolk who had gathered, the young mother, Mr. Dale, Margaret, Pastor Green, watched in silence. It wasn't judgment they carried anymore, but the beginnings of community healing. They had seen Lily abandoned in the snow, and they had stayed silent then. Now they would not. As the sun dipped lower, Ethan gathered Lily and Ranger, preparing to return home. Lily tugged at his sleeve, her hazel eyes bright. "Can Ranger sleep by my bed again tonight?" she asked. Ethan smiled softly. "He wouldn't be anywhere else." She nodded, reassured. Then she added, quieter, "And you too?" His chest tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "Always." That evening, as twilight deepened over Ashwood, the small house on the edge of town glowed with lamplight. Lily lay in bed, her teddy bear tucked beside her. Ranger curled on the floor within arm's reach, his breathing steady. Ethan sat in a chair near the door, fatigue weighing on him, but peace stronger. Outside, the snow melted into streams that sang softly through the woods, carrying away the remnants of winter. And so it ended. A child who had once been cast into the cold now found warmth in chosen family. A broken man began the slow climb toward redemption. A town that had once looked away now chose to care. In the center of it all, a German shepherd lay watchful, a guardian whose loyalty stitched together what grief had torn apart. In the end, this story reminds us of something greater than ourselves, the quiet miracles God places in our path. Sometimes he sends his love through the arms of a child, the loyalty of a German shepherd, or the courage of a police officer who chooses compassion. In our daily lives, we may not always see burning bushes or parted seas, but we do see small miracles, when kindness breaks through loneliness, when forgiveness starts to heal wounds, when a community chooses to care instead of turn away. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with others. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you can join us for more stories of hope and redemption. And if you believe in the miracles of God's love, write Amen in the comments below. May God bless you and your loved ones today and always.